right, are we live? All right. Sounds good. All right, so it's been you have a week break and it feels a little weird. Thanks for coming to Ash Wednesday service. We got Lent underway. We're working our way. We're after Genesis and Exodus, we start speeding up. But I always want to do a little bit of review. Most weeks we'll do a review because really one of the goals for this is to learn the story that leads to Jesus. The Bible is, it's a lot of different books, but ultimately it's a part of a story, and it's important to know that we're a part of the story. We're living. One of the reasons we love movies and stories is because we're in a story. We're living in a part of a story. In the biblical story, we're living towards the end of the story. We don't know when the end is going to be, but there's been a lot of the story that's been lived. So we should be able to understand the story better than most that have come before us. And so we'll do a quick review before we jump into 1 Samuel. I didn't really understand the Bible until I took a class like this in college, and we had to memorize, and I've thought about it, but there were certain bullet points. There was a lot of them. We had to memorize it, and then at the end of it, we had to say it by memory. But all of it was really helpful to understand the story, because the goal is when you're in a church service and the preacher says, well, let's turn to the book of Judges, you're like, oh, I know where that is in the story. I know kind of what's happening here. And next year we'll go through the New Testament, because the same thing, the New Testament is telling a story, not quite in the same way as the Old Testament. The book of Acts is all about the story, but then there's still certain things happening, so that when somebody says, well, let's talk about Ephesians, you kind of have an idea of what's going on in Ephesians. Where are we in the story? So the story starts in the first book of the Bible. So I'm going to fly through the story, but I hope you're kind of thinking ahead and knowing what I'm going to say. You're able to repeat it. The first thing in the story is creation. The idea of everything being good and people made in the image of God, male and female. And then in Genesis chapter 3, we have the fall, where there's separation, there's doubt about the goodness of God, and there's the fall. We have the flood, where after the flood we have the first, the world returns. Creation is about order. There's order comes into the world, and in the flood we return to Genesis 1, chapter 1, where chaos reigns. But after that we have the first covenant with Noah. And so a covenant enters the story with Noah, where God says there's not going to be a flood again. And then we start this rescue plan, this idea of how to bring an end to this separation. The whole story is really about how do we make God, a holy God, and sinful humans being able to live together again. Who's the first man in the story? The first man is Adam. You're right. Poor question. In this story here, Abraham is the first man of the Israelite nation. Abraham and Sarah. And then it goes Isaac. Then it goes Jacob. And once Jacob comes, then the family starts to procreate at a more rapid rate. Then there's 12 sons and one daughter. And then they end up in Egypt. In Egypt, we have the book of Exodus. So they end up in Egypt, and they end up enslaved. And this is really the birth of the nation when they exit Egypt. You have probably the most important chapter in the Old Testament, I would argue, Exodus chapter 19, where you have God proposing to this nation, will you follow me? And you have the second covenant, and it's that's the third, because there's a covenant with Abraham. And then after this nation is rebirthed as a free nation, there's a covenant at Mount Sinai. And the nation accepts God's proposal and says, we trust you, we're with you, let's journey through life together. And it comes up in 1 Samuel a couple times, very interestingly, but this whole nation, when in Genesis 12, when God said, when he called Abraham, what was the goal? What was the goal of the calling of Abraham? Yes, to bless the whole earth. It's not just to bless this nation or a special Mr. Abraham. It's always been about not just the Jew, but the Gentile. It's been about all of humanity. The story's always about all of humanity. So to bless the whole earth. And as we read the story through Jesus, like Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel's always falling short. As humans, we always fall short. Jesus is the one faithful Israelite where this is going to be fulfilled. But even in this story of Exodus, we talked about that throughout the story, it keeps saying the goal here is not to punish Israel or some petty revenge. It's so the whole world will know that the Egyptian gods are not the real God. They're false gods. That the God of this slave nation is the God of creation, is the one true mighty God. And you're going to see it in 1 Samuel again. So the goal of this was, I want people to know who God really is. As they left Egypt, they went up to the promised land, and they were scared of the people there. And so in the book of Numbers, the people wander for 40 years. 40 is a number of completion, a number of a generation. And so they wander for 40 years in the desert. And then you have, I'm running out of white. Then you have Joshua. And Joshua leads the people into the promised land. The story starts to turn violent, starts to turn pretty dark. The people start to be pretty violent as they enter into the promised land. But once again, they go through a river. And once again, it's kind of another new birth, a new beginning in this promised land. And Joshua ends with a charge, choose this day who you'll serve. And the people, just like they did in Exodus 19, said, we're going to serve the Lord, but it doesn't last long. The people are fickle. Then you had the book of Judges. This is what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Judges aren't like lawyers or courts. They're leaders. They're spiritual leaders. They're people that are going to lead the people in battle. In the book of Judges, you have this idea of a circle, where at the top of the circle, they're following God and their life is going well. There's order. But then they start to follow Genesis 3, and they start to doubt God, and they start to follow other gods. And then their life starts to go into chaos. And then they get trapped, and they leave God, and then they're ensnared in their sin, and they eventually get ensnared by other peoples, and they suffer. And in their suffering, they cry out to God, and it's this reminder that God's always a God of grace and mercy. God's a God of forgiveness and fresh starts. And in their suffering, he comes and rescues them by a judge. And then their life has order again, and it flourishes until they start to doubt again. And it's a picture of my life. It's a picture of our life. We go through this cycle ourselves. But it does in the Judges. And what did we talk about? Judges goes from somewhat some light, but it just goes darker and darker and darker. So in the book of Judges, it keeps saying this rhythm, this rhyme, that in that day there was no king. In that day the people did as they saw fit. There was no leader. Judges gets more and more violent. It gets darker and darker. And the last 2 or 3 chapters of Judges is just full of violence and awfulness. And that's kind of where we are in the story. And in Samuel, it gets a little bit better, but the whole story, like I always think, like, man, if you were Jewish at some level as you go through the Old Testament, like, it's a story of a lot of failure, and it's a story of a lot of darkness. Thanks be to God that we have the bright light of Jesus, that we read this through Jesus. We're going to see today again, like, how unfaithful the leaders of Israel were, for the most part, not all of them. Samuel's going to be a bright light. But these leaders are going to be such failures until you get to Jesus, the one faithful covenant partner who is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. All right, so if you have your Bibles open to 1 Samuel, we're going to walk through a few things here. Don't be afraid to interrupt me with any questions or observations. I'm going to erase this. Now, let's see. Let's go to Judges. Sorry, my day's been a little crazy with all this moving. Let's see. I think it's the last. How does Judges end? Oh, yeah, you got Ruth. Ruth is a bright light. We talked about that last week. Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, like all bright lights. But if you go back to Judges 21, and this refrain has been happening throughout Judges. It ends with this: in those days Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. So there's chaos, and there's rebellion, and there's violence, and there's darkness. And once again, who is supposed to be the king? Yes. So Israel is a very unique nation amongst these nations, and they're supposed to get people to think about what's going on here. But every nation has a king, and every nation has a human king. But in the Old Testament, God, or Yahweh, as it's said in the Hebrew, Yahweh is the king. Now, this is very unusual, highly unusual. They're supposed to trust and follow Yahweh as their king, and we're going to see this. We're going to see this change. So when Judges says this, Yahweh's still the king, but what's being recorded here is that Yahweh's the king in name only. Like, you say I'm the king, but I'm not really the king. Like, you're following your wishes, you're following whatever you desire, and so it's this period of darkness. Now, throughout the story, especially now, it's going to really crank up. There's trying to think if there's any real prophets named before this. Does anybody if anybody thinks of prophets that have come up in the story? There maybe are some, but now we're going to really start to see these prophets. And prophets are people that speak for God. They're usually people that are willing to say some hard truths. And so in 1 Samuel, we're going to see this prophet named Eli. Then you're going to have the prophet Samuel. Then you're going to have the prophet Nathan. Make sure I get them in order here. Well, then you're going to have this prophet named Gad. He's a lesser character in the story, but he's there. So if you take the time, which I encourage you to do, to read all of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you're going to see these prophets prop up. And they're not the king, but they are spiritual leaders, and they are people that are going to they're going to continually challenge the people to follow Yahweh. At least the good prophets do. And you're going to see this go from Yahweh as king to human kings. So in the story after Judges, we call this period in the story. So for the next, you're going to hear me say this a lot, but we're going to be in this period called the United Kingdom. So you have Joshua when the people enter the land, but then they have Yahweh as king. Then you have the Judges with all this rebellion and suffering, and then you're going to have, starting in 1 Samuel, the United Kingdom, where Israel is a kingdom like all the other kingdoms. Little Bible trivia: who are the three kings? There's only three kings before it becomes the divided kingdom. So only three kings keep the country together. Who are they? Saul. Yep. Gotta spell my own name right. And then the third one, Solomon. Yep. SDS. So these are the three kings of the United Kingdom. And so it starts here in 1 Samuel. So tonight we're going to talk about, how does this happen? How do you go from Yahweh as king to Saul as king? So let's go to Samuel chapter 1. Right away we start with this kind of heartbreaking story where this man, Elkanah, has two wives. Not for sure how to say them. Hannah's pretty easy to say. Hannah and Peninnah. That's how I'll say it. I always say with these Old Testament names, if you say them loud and confidently, nobody will challenge you. You just got to go loud and confident, because most people, unless you're like a Hebrew scholar, but even the Hebrew scholars, I don't know if they know exactly how to say proper names. So Hannah and Peninnah, so were married to Elkanah. Elkanah really loved Hannah, and Hannah was barren. Who else has had a problem having children in the story? This is a common theme. Again, I think God aligns himself with those that are on the bottom, those that are suffering. And it's a common theme that God's people suffer because God wants his people to know about suffering and to be compassionate to people who are suffering. I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much suffering in God's nation. Like, why would God have a nation where his nation starts as slaves? Well, because of what Jesus says is, I notice the poor, the foreigner, the slave, and so I want my people to notice them. And if you've been through trauma, like if you've been through a death of a child, well, you're going to have a lot more compassion for somebody else that's had the death of a child. And so throughout the story, the story says it over and over, like, remember you were slaves in Egypt, so don't do that to people. Remember that you were a foreigner in Egypt, so be nice to the foreigners. The people have a hard time remembering, as we do, but one of their stories was the real trauma of not being able to have a child. So back to my question, who are some other women that struggled to have children? Sarah, yep, right out of the gate. Abraham and Sarah. Who else? Yep, Rachel, the beloved wife of Jacob. Who else? There's also Rebecca. Rebecca struggled. So the first women of this family, again, they were all aligned with this pain, this real fear. Like, if you don't have children in the ancient world, you're in a really dangerous place. And it's interesting enough, I have in my notes, which is true, like, did they have a problem with having children in slavery? No. Now, I'm sure some women probably did, but the story says that they were having so many children. And again, it seemed like in that really terrible spot of slavery, one thing that they were able to have is that they were able to have a lot of children. But now we're back into the story, and now Hannah is childless, and she's desperate to have a baby. So the story picks up with her going to the temple where Eli was the priest and the prophet, and she is crying out to the Lord. Now, another theme that comes up in the story. So, for in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9. I wrote down chapter 1, verse 9, but where does it say? It says that Eli has two sons who are quite rebellious. So it's not in what's that? What verse is it? 2:12. Oh, chapter 2, verse 12. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. I don't know why I put that in my notes here. Yeah. So there's this theme of these rebellious sons. But let's go to chapter 1, verse 11. Hannah's praying, and she makes this vow to the Lord. She says, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." And so she's bargaining with the Lord. Now, I want to pause here. Remember, in the Old Testament narratives, as we read them, it tells the story, but I don't know if never is probably the right word, rarely says if what the characters in the story are they doing something good or bad. It's just telling the story. It's not giving a blessing or saying, you probably shouldn't do it that way. So this is a very interesting prayer. The question is this a good way to pray? Is this like an example of a way that we should be praying? I'm leading us to say, no, I'm not trying to blame Hannah. Hannah's a desperate woman. But what is she doing? She's like saying, well, God, if you do this, then I'll do that. if you do this, then I'm going to do this for you. Like almost, she's trying to, when you pray like that, you're desperate. So don't feel guilty if you've prayed that way, or maybe you prayed that way today. But in the end, like that kind of a prayer is trying to like bargain with God, to say, well, okay, I'll do this for you, and you need this for me. And God's like, no, I don't need that. Like I can get Samuel as a prophet. I don't need you to have a baby in order to have a prophet. Jesus never says like this then is how you should pray. Offer God something really valuable, and then he'll do what you want him to do. Jesus says, this then is how you should pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. He says, give me your daily bread, which is more than just food, to say, give me what I need. And so we can read this and say, okay, if I want something from God, I should pray this way. Well, no, again, Jesus is our guide. He never says this. And in the end, it's really a way that you would pray to a pagan god. The idea in the story, though, is that Hannah is just simply very desperate. And in her desperation, God sees her and feels her pain, and he does answer her prayer. Thanks be to God, we don't have to pray exactly correct in order for God to hear us and answer our prayer. God isn't always that concerned about it, I don't think. He sees Hannah's pain, and he answers the prayer, and the baby who is born is Samuel. So it's in the story, it's in chapter 1, verse 20. So in the course of time, Hannah became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, because I asked the Lord for him. And Hannah, being very faithful to what she said, she brings Samuel to the temple, and after he's weaned, she gives him over to Eli, which is an amazing act. Like, she's true to what she said. And if you read the story carefully, she has a few more kids after this. And so she is blessed. But she brings him to the temple eventually. And then Hannah's another woman. Who are some other women that have written prayers? You have Mary, the mother of Jesus. You have Deborah in Judges. You have Moses' sister in Exodus. These women that write very deep prayers and songs. And even at the end of Hannah's prayer, there's this language that is pointing to the Messiah one day. And so Hannah overall is an exemplary person in this story. Let's go to Samuel 2, verse 12. Eli's sons were scoundrels, as Carol pointed out. This is the verse. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. When you read the story, they're robbing the people. They're taking from the people as they come to the temple. And it's very much like when Jesus went into the temple and overturned the tables. It was because the religious leaders were taking advantage of the people, and this is what Eli and his sons were doing, and so this will all be kind of a part of the story. You get to chapter 3, verse 1, and here you have Samuel at the temple, and he's ministering before the Lord under Eli. Look at what it says. Remember how Judges ended? Look at chapter 3, verse 1 of 1 Samuel. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Again, we're in a very dark period right after the Judges ended. And then Samuel is there, and you have this well-known, beautiful story where Samuel is laying down, and the voice of the Lord calls out to him, and Samuel doesn't know what's going on. He hears this voice. And Samuel runs to Eli and says, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." And in verse 6, again the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." And my son Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. And the third time in verse 8, Samuel, and he got up, and Eli said, "I didn't call you." But then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Now, this is a good, theologically sound prayer for all of us. "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." as we talk about breath prayers, or even as we want to hear direction in our own life or the voice of God, and not that we're going to hear an audible voice necessarily, but this is a sound prayer. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. To even just spend 5 minutes just thinking about those words, like what decision you're facing or where your life is at. I want to hear you, Lord. Speak to me. Your servant is listening. So in all of Eli's chaos of his life, like, he realized it was God, and he told Samuel some really good advice, a prayer that God's going to answer. And so Samuel went and laid down, and then the Lord came and stood there, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And then in verse 10, Samuel said, Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And then what the Lord tells Samuel is that that there's going to be some very awful things happening to Eli's family. If you read 1 Samuel 3, he talks about the death of his sons, that Eli failed to restrain his sons. And then Samuel gets this news. Look at verse 14. Therefore I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Verse 15, Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house, and he was afraid to tell Eli the vision. Let's pause here for a second. So he gets this amazing word from God. It's basically your mentor, your boss, his life is in too much chaos. He's not going to be the prophet much longer. His sons are going to die. Samuel knows that when he gets up in the morning, what's Eli going to do? Eli's going to say, what did the Lord tell you? Samuel has a choice in the midst of this. It's either to be a prophet or an advisor. We face this choice a lot of times. As pastors, we can face this choice. A lot of our pastors in the nation, our pastors that are in the White House or in politics, face this choice all the time. I was watching a really interesting documentary about the 1980s. If you were alive then, the moral majority was starting, and in a lot of ways, like, evangelical Christianity aligned itself with the Republican Party a lot. And there was a very interesting quote. I thought I wrote it. Oh yeah, here it is. He said, well, here's the thing, and this is something we face as pastors. We face it as people. Are you going to be a prophet or an advisor? What's the difference? So the prophet can speak the truth to anybody, but you will have very little influence. You will speak the truth, but you won't have much influence. Why? Because when you speak the truth, especially to powerful people, they kick you out or they kill you. They don't want to hear it. They kick you out or they kill you. And so the prophets, from now on in the story till Jesus, you're going to have all kinds of prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah. Well, they get kicked out. They don't get listened to. He said, well, you can be an advisor. An advisor, you have a lot of influence. You can't speak the truth. In this documentary, they said, well, we chose to be advisors because we wanted a seat with the powerful people. And it's still happening today. Like, yeah, you can be an advisor, so you get a lot of influence. You get to stay in the room where it happens, as the song goes. But you can't really speak the truth, because if you do, you get kicked out. And Samuel has this choice. Is he going to be an advisor to Eli, or is he going to be a prophet? Now, what you're going to see in the story, and for me personally, the question is, can I listen to prophets, or will I kick them out of my life? So there's times in our life where people have to tell us hard things. And when somebody tells me a hard thing, will I kick them out, or will I listen? In the story, it's pretty rare for people to listen to prophets, but you're going to see some. One is Eli. Eli isn't going to kick Samuel out. Eli's not going to kill Samuel. Eli's going to listen to him. And another one, we're going to talk about David next week. David has a ton of flaws. David makes so many mistakes. But the one thing that David does do is that he listens to prophets. Meaning he's willing to say, I'm wrong. The thing that David's going to do, which Eli will also do really, is David's going to be able to be a person who will repent. And so this is a big question. There's people in our lives sometimes that are prophetic, or to say, hey, your life's going astray, or hey, this way that you're living is chaos. Sometimes it's just the Holy Spirit. Sometimes it's just this conviction of God saying, hey, why are you running from me? Why are you turning your back on me? And we have a question, like, will we kick the prophets out? Because if we only have advisors, they're going to just say what they need to say to stay close to us. That's not always the most helpful. So in the story, Samuel, where is it in the story? Now I'm outside of my notes. Yep. Yeah. Well, there can be good advisors. Advisors aren't going to speak the truth. There are false prophets, but they also are more like advisors. The false prophets in the Bible, we'll talk about them in Jeremiah, they tell the powerful people what they want to hear. That's what a false prophet is. Like they're going to tell the powerful people that they're okay and what they're doing is good. And the Bible calls them false prophets. I kind of have a different name for them, advisors. They're going to make sure that they keep influence. They're going to make sure that they keep a place at the table. And you do that by not challenging the people who are powerful. And so I think you could, as Warner said, you could give them a different name, false prophet. In the Bible story, I think you could say there's some people that are good advisors. I'm going to make the delineation. If you're a good advisor, you're a prophet. You're going to say the truth, even if it hurts. I'm kind of using these two from the documentary that I'm saying. And you're right, in the biblical story, it's either like you're a prophet or you're a false prophet. And what the Bible highlights are people that are willing to speak the truth, even if it means they lose their influence. That's what we want to be. We want to be people who are willing to lose influence by speaking the truth. Advisors, the way I'm using it, I understand what you're saying. I think a good advisor is somebody that would speak the truth. So you might want to cross that out and say a false prophet is someone that's going to prioritize their influence over the truth. And you'll see that in the biblical story, and you see it a lot even in the church. Does that make a little more sense? Yeah. So in chapter 3, Samuel, look at the story. He says, look at verse 17. What is it he said to you, Eli asked. Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide anything he told you. Well, that's a tough spot. So welcome to ministry, Samuel. In verse 18, so Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from his eye. Then Eli said, it is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his own eyes. Again, that's a bold statement, because he got told that his sons were going to die and that he failed as a father, really, which we're going to see that theme as well. And Eli didn't make excuses, didn't get angry at Samuel. He said, let the Lord do what is good in his eyes. And then in verse 19, the Lord was with Samuel, and he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, where he there revealed himself to Samuel through his words.
So Samuel tells Eli, happen because you're falling short on all these things.
Yeah.
Eli doesn't change his ways, does he?
Doesn't seem so in the story.
So Samuel grew and watched Eli continue all these bad traits and habits. So, you think he was advising Eli at some point, saying, hey, you think this is the best course of action based on what the Word of God has told you already? Again, we can only speculate.
Yeah, we don't get a glimpse.
Constantly shaking his head.
Right. It seemed like Samuel got a good lesson in what not to do. It seems like, yeah, you're right. I mean, in my notes, I wrote chapters 4 to 6, things get worse. Like to your point, Eli is kind of okay with what God's going to do, but it doesn't seem like he makes a radical change. We don't know for sure, but I mean, also his sons are already growing and they're already stealing from the people. And what can you do as an older, elderly man with growing sons? Like, I don't know. But yeah, things in the story get pretty radically worse. Yeah. Yeah, what Hannah was thinking. I mean, it seems like overall Eli himself wasn't all terrible. Like he was trying, but he seemed like he wasn't a great father for sure. And yeah, Hannah, that Samuel's potentially hanging out with his two sons who are just kind of who are terrible. Yeah, we don't know. We don't get all the glimpses that we'd like to get. Like, what did you think, Hannah, as this was going on? Look at 1 Samuel 4, 6 to 11. So the Philistines are one of their enemies. In chapter 4, verse 1, the Israelites go out to fight fight them. And it says in verse 2 that Israel was defeated by the Philistines. And so in verse 4, so the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant. So they're getting beat by the Philistines, and then it seems like they bring the ark out as like, maybe this will give us victory. Like, again, they're using God in poor ways, and God's not going to be manipulated. And so the ark was supposed to be in the holies of holies, the place where the Spirit of God dwelt, and they bring it out. And look at what it says in verse 5. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness." So remember, the whole goal of Exodus was that the world would know who the real God is. So we get these glimpses that they did know, that the word had gotten out about who this God was. And in verse 9 it says, "Be strong, Philistine men, or you'll be subject to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So they're nervous, but they're still going to go fight. We see this again in 1 Samuel 6:6. Let's just go to 1 Samuel 6:6, where it says, this is a different callback to the story, but here they're this, "Why did you harden your hearts as the this is further in the story, but why did you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did when God dealt harshly with them and did not send the Israelites out so they could go on their way?" So here the Philistines are suffering, and they're calling back again that they remember that the Egyptians hardened their heart and they suffered a lot as they battled against Yahweh. So it's just this idea that this whole goal had been achieved. The world knew who Yahweh was when they walked out of Egypt without ever raising a sword. So anyway, back to chapter 4. They bring the ark out, and the Philistines are afraid, but they go and fight. And they capture, it says in verse 11, this is a dark verse, "The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died." Now, I complain about some of the translations in the Bible, but I want to give the NIV some kudos. If you read carefully Samuel 4, 5, and 6, you're going to see this word heavy. It's the Hebrew word kavod. It's mentioned many times. And so it's a wordplay in Hebrew. But in the NIV, I think every time they translate it as heavy, heavy, heavy. And it's this idea that there's this heaviness. In this story, they're taking the Ark of the Covenant and they're trying to use it as a toy of like, okay, if we bring this out, God will give us victory, treating God like a pagan God. And God's like, no, you're not going to manipulate me like that. You guys are evil. And God lets the Ark get captured. And there's this heaviness in the story. And now the Ark is in the hands of the Philistines, which is very sad and very heavy. In verse 12, there's this Benjamite. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. He ran away from the battle, and he ran all the way back to Eli. And Eli asked him, tell me the truth. What happened? And this young man was a prophet. He told him what happened. Your boys are dead, and the Philistines have the Ark of God. And when Eli heard that, where does it say that Eli died? What verse is it? Verse 18. When he mentioned the Ark of God, so he'd already heard his sons died, but it's interesting for Eli, when he heard that the Ark of God was captured, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man, and he was heavy. There's this wordplay. It's meaning that Eli was overweight, but if you read this, you also all have this rhythm of things were heavy, things were bad. He had led Israel for 40 years. There's that number 40 again. His time was complete. It was time for Samuel to lead Israel. So we have a very interesting story about this story of the ark. I want to see what... As I've been talking about violence and about this idea that when the Israelites left Egypt and they didn't raise a finger, and that it seems like, and we talked about a lot of verses that say this, that God was going to send a hornet ahead and God was going to do it. They weren't going to have to do anything, that they weren't going to have to commit genocide like they did or kill women and babies. Now in this we see another glimpse of this, of how this happened in Egypt. It happens again. When you read the story in chapter 6 and 7, the Philistines take this ark of God, of Yahweh, and they put it by their main god, Dagon, and they bring it to this pagan temple. And what happens to the Philistines when they do this? Yeah, Dagon falls down, right? And then what happens to the Philistines? Yeah, they get a bunch of tumors. Like they start to get really sick, and they start to get these growths and these tumors. So they keep moving the ark to different towns, and wherever the ark goes, these tumors break out again. And so you have this battle of who's really God. So these gods were gods of fertility. They're gods of health. They're gods of wellness. And so when the ark is there, they're like, "No, you're not going to be well." It's kind of a reverse battle, but it's a battle of like who's really in control here. And so this ark keeps bouncing to different towns. And I think in chapter 7, one of the towns finally was like, no, don't bring it here. Please don't bring it here. I read this today, and I didn't have it in my original notes, but I want to, let's go to verse 7. So the ark had been bouncing from town to town. And then look at chapter 7, verse 10. While Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offerings, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day, the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such panic that they were routed before the Israelites. That sounds a lot like Exodus 23, right? Like the hornet that's going to go. In Exodus 23, it says, you're not going to have to lift a finger. I'm going to drive them out. It seems like, again, we get a glimpse of what that was maybe supposed to look like, because here it was happening. The Philistines got into such panic that they were fleeing. Now it's interesting, the next sentence, again, remember the Old Testament doesn't tell you if it's good or bad in the story. It just tells you the story. Once the people were in panic and were leaving, which it seems like they were going to run away and they were going to be victorious, but what did the Israelites do? They grabbed swords and slashed them and killed them all. Were they supposed to do that or not? It doesn't say. If you live by the teachings of Jesus, no. Like your enemy's fleeing, let them flee. The words of Jesus don't really give any license for the men of Israel rushed out and slaughtered them. That's what my Bible says. Slaughtered them along the way to the point below Beth Kur. At the end of the story, the Ark of the Covenant ends back up in Israel. Not because the Israelites were slaughtering them, but because everywhere the Ark went, people were getting sick. And so they loaded it on some cattle and they sent it back. They sent it back to the Israelites. And again, this whole idea is Yahweh is the Lord of Lords. But so far, not many are recognizing it, not the Philistines and not the Israelites. Now let's go to chapter 9. Well, let's go to chapter 8 here. Chapter 8, verse 1. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second son was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, accepted bribes, perverted justice. Eli, his sons, Samuel, his sons. You're going to see this same thing with, ironically, like David, I don't want to spoil next week's lessons too much, but David's sons were disasters. Ironically, who had the best son in the story? Yeah, good answer. Mary did have the best son in the story. In the Old Testament story, I think by far the best son was Saul. Saul had who? Jonathan. Jonathan becomes a Christ-like figure in the story. So the worst king has the best son, and the Christ-like people, their sons are really struggle. You know, I don't know how much you read into it. I don't know, but that's how the story goes. We all know parenting is super difficult. Yeah, pastors' kids. Let's not get started on them. Yeah. But it is true. Pastors' kids have a reputation, and it can be earned. Chapter 4. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel, and they said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Such as, we want to be like everybody else.
See, I get confused there. Because if I'm them,
Yeah.
and you're having this Samuel being a good, leading them good, but they know when Samuel's gone, it's going to be these
Sure.
kids that are,
Yeah.
they can't be trusted.
Right.
So if I'm there thinking, well,
I don't want these
my
two.
next person that leads us,
Right.
so I might be saying the same thing.
Yeah. So, I don't want these two to lead us. We might be saying the same thing. As you say that, like, I haven't thought about this too much, but like you have God as king, but God is invisible. Like he's Yahweh. So at some level, like, how much different is it between God be like a king and isn't Samuel kind of the king? Isn't Eli kind of the king? Isn't the main priest kind of the king? I would think so, but for these people, some way it was still different. Like ideally, these people were close to God and they're leading people towards Yahweh, and Yahweh is the king. And so in the minds of the people, it's like Eli's the main pastor, the leader. He's kind of the human figure, but Yahweh's the king. And this nation's been going for a while, so I think the language is really important, because when they're saying, they're not asking for a priest, like let's make a high priest. They're asking for a king. And so I think that's a clear rejection of like, it's not just a rejection of his sons, it's a rejection of Yahweh. I mean, that's what the text is going to say pretty soon. So I think...
But then if the sons are supposed to represent Yahweh,
Yeah.
after Samuel passes,
Yeah. Is there anybody...
it's a poor representation of
Right.
Yahweh.
Right. To your point, the people might be kind of between a rock and a hard place. I mean, the way Judges ended, like it's a dark time. Samuel, I think, has been somewhat of a bright light. Eli, but yeah, it's a dark time. In the end, it's seen as like this king language is a rejection of Yahweh. And they're saying, we don't want him anymore. We want a human figure like everybody else has. And it says it so much in verse 6. When they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So the story gets dark. Keeps getting darker. I wish it was brighter, but this...
We don't have any knowledge on what was the economy or the food supply or anything like that, I imagine.
Yeah, they're in the promised land. It seems like, it does tell us in the story when there's famine. It doesn't mention that. It seems like... I'm
just wondering if they're like looking at the neighboring nation, their economy is flourishing, their unemployment rates are down, and everything is just, perfect. Yeah, I don't know. Comparison can be the thief of joy. It definitely seems like they're looking at other nations and they're jealous of them. Like they have kings and we don't. And it's always hard to be the misfit. It's always hard to kind of stand out. I don't know. They obviously think our life would be better if there was a king. We can't know exactly why. There's a really interesting passage I want to read in Deuteronomy. Let's go to Deuteronomy 17. So in this whole story, Israel is so different because Yahweh is the king. But if you go back to Deuteronomy, this is when the nation is just starting out and they're figuring it out. There's a really interesting passage right in the middle of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verse 14. The beginning of chapter 17 talks about worshiping other gods and not to do it. And then when you read the whole story of Deuteronomy, they are not supposed to have a king. Yahweh is their king. But then you have this little caveat. It's almost like a prediction of the future. It says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settle in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. It's like predicting judges. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. So he's supposed to be a king, not like the other kings. All kings want more and more and more. This king is not supposed to be that way. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself a scroll, a copy of this law, taken from the Levitical priest, and it's to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of his law and decrees. And do not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the left or to the right. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So this is not supposed to happen, but God kind of says, you're going to probably do it. So if you do it, make sure it's this. Now, if you read that and you get to the third king, well, David breaks a bunch of those commandments too, but Solomon breaks them all. He takes a wife from Egypt. Solomon takes, I forget, does anybody remember how many wives Solomon had? It was an absurd number of wives. Solomon accumulated for himself large amounts of gold and silver, and at the end of it, the kingdom splits. The kingdom is over. At the end of Solomon's life, it's civil war. Yeah. Yep. And again, if you read this, human kings don't live like this until you get to Jesus, right? Like this description of what the king is like. Jesus is the faithful king. He is the one, and I'm going to close with this tonight. When we talk about Jesus, I gotta be more flexible. We've been. One of the things I hope you
hear me say a lot, and so you know it, is that when we talk about Jesus, we talk about this, an upside down kingdom. Because we talk about the church or the rule of Jesus as a kingdom, but it's upside down, which means it's different. Again, it's not one that uses the sword. We keep wanting Jesus to use the sword. But even if you read Revelation carefully, he doesn't use a sword in his hand. The sword is in his mouth. It's the words. It's not a sword in his hand. It's an upside down kingdom. And so Israel was supposed to be this way. Yahweh being king instead of a human king was upside down. A nation that was supposed to treat the foreigners well, a nation that's not supposed to get large amounts of silver and gold and not great numbers of horses and not have many wives. When you have many wives in the ancient world, it means you're making treaties with other countries and you're building networks and wealth. And so even this description, if you have a king, it's got to be an upside down king. This is the struggle of the church. We're supposed to live in this world upside down, different, not like everybody else. And we struggle. I struggle. We all can struggle to do it. And you see glimpses of this throughout the story. So Abraham is the first one, but he doesn't even have any kids until late. Isaac only has one kid. He's called to sacrifice him, and then they end up as slaves. But then you have Jacob and Esau, and instead of Esau being the firstborn being the one, it's the secondborn. It's all these upside down things that really accumulate with Jesus. And even if you read the story of Saul's not completely upside down, because one of the things that I think fits, which is interesting, is that he was taller than everybody else. And so height always gives you authority and a commanding presence. But look at when Saul is called. What chapter is he called as king? He doesn't want the job. He tries to not get the job. Saul starts out in the story, as good, and Saul ends really poorly. But look at what he says when he's called. I got my notes are all messed up. When he's called, Saul first says, well, I'm a Benjamite, and there's 12 tribes, and Saul makes the case that Benjamin is the least of the tribes. And then Saul says, and I don't have the verses marked, I'm the least in the tribe of Benjamin. And he's making all of these cases why he shouldn't be king. Most times people want to be king, right? I want the power. I want to be the man. I want the attention. When Saul is called, if somebody can find those verses, he's making excuses I'm from Benjamin and I'm the least of the tribe of Benjamin. And then when Samuel comes to introduce Saul as king, he can't find Saul because Saul's away hiding under some stuff. He's trying not to be seen. And so this is an upside down. Why are you calling this guy? He doesn't want the attention. He's trying to hide under the tents. And so these are the kind of people God always uses. But if you read the end of Saul's life, he suddenly thinks he's the man. He suddenly thinks, I'm the guy, and he suddenly has an ego, and he suddenly becomes quite insecure about other people, and he starts to be a king like all kings are, very insecure, very power hungry, very look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest. And when Saul starts to do that, he starts to go downhill. No king really pulls it off until Jesus comes. And Jesus shows us what the upside down kingdom is like. And our goal is to not follow the example of Saul or David or Solomon, but to follow the example of Jesus. I'll close us in prayer, and then we can jump into some questions. God, thank you for your forgiveness for us. So many times we go our own way and we get distracted. Our life starts to become more and more chaotic, and then we call out to you. We thank you that you are so gracious and so merciful, that you are eager to bring us back and to give us a fresh start. I pray as we live our lives and we parent and we go through hard times, we make decisions, we look at the direction of our life, that you would help us to find times to be still, where we could hear your voice, where we could just pray the prayer of Samuel. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. I pray as you're a prophet in our life a lot, you're showing us where we're off base, where things we need to let go of, things that we need to change in our life, that we might listen to that prophetic voice, that whether if it comes from you or another human, that we might be humble and we might have ears to hear and eyes to see. And God, we ask and we hope that we can live this upside down kingdom so we can show the world a really beautiful way to live where we follow Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right. Anybody find the verse where Saul's hiding?
22.
Which chapter?
10.
10.
20 through
Yeah.
20.
No, they can't find. So they inquired. So in verse 22, so they inquired further of the Lord, has this man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he has hidden himself among the supplies. That's the king. Go get him. Which is such a Jesus thing. Like, yeah, he's not the one anybody would predict it. And they probably rolled their eyes. Oh, geez. But then Saul starts to get full of himself. Did anybody find the verses where Saul's saying he's a Benjamite? 9:21. Saul answered, but am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel, and is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? I don't want the job. But he gets the
Now, is
job.
that true? Was it supposed to come from the tribe of Judah?
The king?
Or this part?
No, I think,
Maybe I'll have to.
is that what you're talking about, Jesus?
Did Saul have any, was that partially correct? Him saying like,
Yeah.
true?
Yeah. I think this whole thing could be true. Like, again, it's the upside down kingdom. Like David was like he wasn't the firstborn. He was like, in the ancient world, the firstborn was it. David was, I don't know, where was David? Like 8th or 9th in the order. So yeah, I think all of this is true.
I think the prophet sons.
You mean you're talking about the prophesying for Jesus? Well, I don't think it's about the kingship. I mean, the kingship was all rebellion from the beginning. Like, it wasn't supposed to happen. Yeah, I have to read that.
What happened to the ark?
Well, they put the ark with some cattle,
Right.
and the cattle brought it back. Yeah.
Flip a coin. But where is it now?
Oh, where is it now? Oh, that's the can of worms you're trying to open.
Where did it go?
Well, there's some movies. There's some good movies about
Is
that.
this the last mention of the ark?
I don't think so.
Was it comes up a couple more?
I would, yeah, I think it comes up some more. Yeah, we don't really know. I mean, the Ethiopians say they have it. Yeah, who is that? Is it Harrison Ford that was trying to find it? Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think in 70 A.D. the Romans came and ransacked the temple and they burned it. So the ark easily, like it says, the gold melted in between the bricks. So most likely it got melted down. People are trying to find it. Like, yeah, it would be quite the find if somebody stumbles on it. I don't think it'll ever be found. Well, they don't really know if they found Noah's Ark or not, but yeah, it's kind of like some of those things are kind of like who's the big guy, this isn't biblical. Like, there's black cutouts of him. I'm blanking out on the Sasquatch. Yeah. Bigfoot. Yeah. The pictures are always really fuzzy. Like, I haven't seen any real proof of the ark. There's a lot of the times that the pictures I've seen of Mount Ararat is still all kind of fuzzy. It's like, well,
He's in Carlos Avery.
right. Can somebody get a good camera and take a picture of this, please? Yeah, the ark would be interesting if they could, if it could be proven without a shadow of a doubt, but I haven't heard that they've been able to find it. But there's a lot of things, a lot of people digging. Like archaeology over there is a huge deal. And archaeologists have way more patience than I do. Man, they are very, very professional. So you never know what they're going to dig up. Yeah.
That's what Egypt had.
Right.
We want that.
Right. Right. It's really hard to be upside down. Yeah, it's hard. Yeah. Even now as Christians, we think that there's a time to use power, to use the ways of the world. And it's confusing because like in the New Testament, it will use fight language, but we always fight with love. We don't fight with weapons. It'll, like in Ephesians, it ends with like the warrior getting dressed, but the belt of truth. We're out to like in some ways fight, you could say, but it's upside down. It's so different. But as soon as we hear fight, we're like, oh, good, we get to go beat somebody up. Like, no, we don't. That's not what we're about. Right.
That's the heavy.
Pick up your cross, not your sword. Yep. Pick up your cross and follow me. Like Jesus is pretty clear, but we always want to find a way to go power over. And this whole thing is power under. And the church is supposed to be subversive. We don't need government. We don't need anything. Nobody can stop us. We're always working behind the scenes. And like Jesus said, the church is like a tree that just keeps growing. You can't stop it. The building's great, but we don't need a building. Like if they came and said, you can't be in this building, like fine. You can't stop us. People say, well, they took prayer out of school. Like, no, they didn't. The government cannot take prayer out of school because any human in there can pray at any moment. And so there's no way you can take prayer out of any place. That's the beauty of the church and the upside down kingdom, that we're going to go about loving our neighbor and loving our enemy and living the way of Jesus. And there's no way that anybody can stop us. But we're not supposed to use power over. Once we start doing that, we cease to be the church. Like we cease to follow the way of Jesus.
How much is the Old Testament? Like you can always probably make a life application when you have hindsight.
Right.
But like devotional books or sermons, it's like, oh, here's the verse,
Yeah.
Is that the purpose of that verse, or was it just history?
Right. Are you, yeah. Yeah, I think the book that we have, like How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, gives some good parameters, but it does get dicey. Like we will take the story and then make a personal application for us. And we do have to be careful with that. It's not that there isn't things to learn,
Right.
but yeah, it is a story that we're not supposed to necessarily dissect it. So I think there are personal applications, but really the danger is just to do the application. Like I grew up like just hearing about Gideon and the 300 men. And then you don't read the rest of Gideon where he turns into a violent, awful person. It's like, well, you're supposed to read the whole story because the whole story leads to Jesus. And we have to know the whole story. So yeah, it can be thin ice, even as preachers. Like you can abuse the story in some way. I should have some 1, 2, 3 parameters. I don't have them memorized. I know in that book it lists out some good ways to use it well and ways that you use it poorly. Right. Right.
And then when the battle took place, the enemy was killing himself.
Right. That's what evil does. I think that was the way that they were supposed to fight. But then they kept going back to the way that kingdoms always fight. Yeah. Because there they had their torches and they blew their trumpets and they started going at each other because that, and that's, you get glimpses, I think, of the way of Jesus, but then so often people go back to their own way. And I think, this is a story we don't talk about a lot, but this 1 Samuel story of these tumors of like, yeah, God will take care of it. He'll take care of it. Yeah. Yeah, even in here, I think that happened. There's a story of the ark on a cart, and it starts to tilt, and they touch it. So you have this idea of the holiness of God being very dangerous in some ways for sinful people, which is the problem Jesus is coming to solve. But yeah, there's a number of stories like that.
What was the relevance with the ark? Like, what is it exactly?
Yeah, so it's a gold box with 2 gold angels above it. It has in it, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, the 10 Commandments, and it has manna, the manna that would be fed for the Israelites. And the staff, Moses' staff. It was in the Holy of Holies. So in the temple, God's Spirit dwelt in this one room where the ark was. So it's really where the presence of Yahweh was, where it was the place of holiness. So humans couldn't go in there. The high priest would go in once a year, and he would go in with a robe that had bells on it, and then he had a rope tied around his ankle. So they knew he was alive if they could hear the bells, and if he died, they could just pull him out. Hebrews talks about it in some beautiful ways. I was just reading a devotional on Hebrews. I think it's Hebrews 10, where it talks about like this access to God that was dangerous and only one human had once a year. Like this was the goal of the cross, was to open up the Spirit of God on all of humanity, because at the cross, forgiveness could be unleashed. So Hebrews talks about it in some really powerful ways. But it's really like this box where the Spirit of God dwelt. So that's why it becomes kind of iconic in mythology. It makes sense to me, like with the cross and with everything that happened, that the Holy of Holies would have been melted and destroyed. It's not needed anymore. Of course, a lot of people think it's hidden somewhere and we can go find it. Yeah.
And that's where the high priest would bring
The once a year.
there once a year. And if the priest wasn't,
Yeah.
why they had that rope around it,
Right.
be destroyed right there.
Right. So you could read Hebrews where now it says, thanks to the blood of Jesus, like we can march right into the Holy of Holies. Like we have access to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that's something we'll talk about next year with the atonement, like what happens at the cross. I never shared the sermon that I had about the sacrifices, so I will do that. Yeah, Jessica.
Maybe a dumb question, but
No, none of them are dumb.
is that why it said that Jesus had to die?
Yeah,
That whole thing that you just said.
yeah. There's a lot about like what happened at the cross, like what really happened, and I think there's a lot that happened. But one is that there was a victory, and the way I think about it is the way I'd like to try to think about it in simple terms. That if sin is complete selfishness and me-centered life, for the holy God who is totally loving and other-centered, like to defeat sin, death, and the devil, to defeat selfishness, it seemed it took this most extreme unselfish act. That the God of the universe became a baby and became subjected to being helpless and being raised as a man, and then going to the cross without any guilt or sin or selfishness in him for the good of humanity, who's his enemy. Like in John, when it says, "For God so loved the world," you really should read that, "For God so loved his enemies that he came." And so it seems like this complete act of love It's so hard because usually when I love somebody, I'm also going to get something from it. Where God's like, God likes our companionship, but he's not lonely, he's not needy, he doesn't need us. Like, he just loves us because he loves us. And so that's that act of complete unselfish love in this realm of evil. I like to think of like Superman. It seems to be like this kryptonite that just destroys evil and death and the devil. And so then at the cross, yeah, God's Spirit was unleashed and forgiveness was unleashed. It seemed like that was the day of darkness, where the devil thought he was winning, he was actually losing. So in Christian terms, we call it Christus Victor. That a lot happened at the cross, but the main thing that happened was victory over the unholy trinity of sin, death, and the devil. So next week we'll get into the end of the United Kingdom. I'll put up on the classroom what to read. I mean, I'm going to put up stuff that I think is manageable to read. I encourage you to read more than that, like to sit down and read. I don't think I'll have you read all of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but it's all a pretty interesting story. I think the Bible Project, I added the Bible Project video late today, but those videos are always so good. And it said, like, this is some of the most interesting narrative in the Old Testament, the way the story that's told of Saul and David and Solomon. But again, in David, we often read just the highlighted portions. If you read the whole story of David, it's pretty convoluted and pretty awful at times. And so we're not just gonna tell David's highlight reel. We'll push into the whole character of David next week. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can get you that. Yeah, have a good night. Let's see. Okay. Okay, yeah. That's an interesting word. If you read the book, interesting word choice.